Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on uncertainty reduction theory. As a reminder, this is one of the theories in our interpersonal unit, and it was originally proposed by scholar Charles Berger. Berger was actually a graduate of Michigan State University, and then he went out on to teach for several years in California. The theory falls on the objective side of our theories. The reason for this, of course, is because the theory does try to do things like generalize and make overarching hypotheses that can be tested, and that can be tested using quantifiable data. And for several other reasons, it's a good fit with our objective theories. As always, our general objectives for the day are to identify not only the major idea of a theory, but also to look at the more specific theoretical components. So specifically today, we're going to be looking at the various axioms and theorems that uncertainty reduction theory suggests. We'll try to apply it to real life, and of course, we'll also try to critique the theory by the end. So let's jump right in. All right, so here you can see I've listed kind of the overall idea of uncertainty reduction theory. Essentially, the theory argues that when we meet a stranger, there is uncertainty. The uncertainty comes from a lack of information, whether it's about the situation, it's about the other person, it's about how to act. But this lack of information tends to lead us to be uncertain about what the outcome will be, what certain behaviors are appropriate. So when we're meeting strangers and we're meeting new people, we experience this uncertainty. And essentially the theory goes on to say, human beings do not like uncertainty. Feeling uncertain, not knowing what's coming next, makes us feel anxious and uncomfortable. And so in general, then, what we try to do is figure out ways to reduce the uncertainty. Right? And the theory offers a lot of different ideas about how we do that. Okay? But in a nutshell, uncertainty reduction theory says meeting new people and being in new situations produces uncertainty. Humans don't like uncertainty, so we try to find ways to reduce it. Okay. The theory does go on to offer three specific factors that tend to increase our uncertainty, they tend to increase our willingness to reduce the uncertainty, or our desire to reduce uncertainty. Okay. So for example, if we anticipate a future interaction with someone, then we are going to be more likely to try to reduce any uncertainty we're feeling than if we anticipate never seeing this person again, right? And maybe you can make some comparisons. Imagine that you go into class for the first day of the semester and you find yourself sitting next to someone that you don't know, versus imagine standing in line at the grocery store next to someone that you don't know. My guess is that in the first situation, you would feel compelled to, or you would feel a lot stronger desire to reduce uncertainty than in the second situation, right? Knowing that in the classroom setting, you probably will see this person again. Odds are you two will sit in the same seats, so you will probably be sitting next to this person again, and you certainly will anticipate interacting with this person for the next several weeks throughout the course of the semester. So that knowing that likely makes you more willing and have more desire to reduce the uncertainty versus the grocery store situation, right? Odds are you'll never see that stranger in front of you in the grocery store again, right? Or at least you won't have any significant interaction with them in the future. Therefore, your desire to reduce any potential uncertainty in that situation is probably pretty low. So anticipation of future events is certainly one factor that would increase our desire to reduce uncertainty. The second item listed there is incentive value. If someone has something that they can give us, or if we desire to earn something from another person, odds are in that case, we are again going to have a stronger desire to reduce the uncertainty, right? It could be something pretty tangible. It could be, let's say, a work situation and you are going up for an interview and you are meeting future colleagues or even the boss, right? They have a job that they can offer you. Odds are you're going to work really hard to try to get to know these people and to reduce your uncertainty. But it can also be things that are maybe not necessarily so tangible, right? I think of a situation where maybe you are going home for the weekend and you are meeting your romantic partner's family, right? In that situation, maybe these individuals don't have something really tangible to offer. They're not giving you a job. They're not giving you money necessarily, but you know that you want their affection, their respect. They want you to like them, right? You have a lot riding on this, right? If you are connected to your romantic partner, anticipate a long-term relationship with him, then it would really benefit you if their family liked you. So that kind of intangible incentive value is also another reason why you probably are going to work really hard to try to reduce uncertainty in that situation. And then the final factor that influences our willingness or desire to reduce uncertainty is simply deviance. And what the theory is saying there is when people act in a deviant or unexpected way, right? Think back to expectancy violation theory. When people engage in some kind of deviance or violation, then we tend to be more likely to reduce uncertainty. That just means we want to figure out why they're acting that way, right? We want to try to explain the deviant or the weird behavior, right? And maybe even weird isn't the right term there, because it could even be something so simple as perhaps someone is like showing up late to the meeting, right? That's a deviant behavior. That's violating a norm. And so, everybody that's there and they're on time, you probably take for granted. There's not much uncertainty there. But someone has shown up late, and whether that's a chronic problem or maybe that's an isolated incident, it's a deviant behavior. And you are likely, you and your colleagues are probably trying to figure out, where is this person, right? Why are they late? Right? Those efforts to figure out or to reduce your uncertainty were brought on by the fact that this person, is committing this deviant act or this showing up late. Okay, so for the exam, you'll make sure you can identify these three factors and explain how they influence one's willingness or efforts to try to reduce uncertainty. All right, we'll move on to the axioms. I do want to take a few minutes talking about these because these were a question in the CPA. And I noticed that some people did a really good job identifying each axiom and explaining it, and some other people had a little bit of trouble with this. So I just want to try to clarify anything here. The first thing I want to point out is simply just listing the variables that have been examined through uncertainty reduction theory is not actually identifying the axioms, right? That's a start, but the axioms, what they do is they actually try to predict how each one of these variables is in some way correlated with uncertainty. Right, so for the exam, in order to prove you understand the axiom, you need to not only be able to identify the variable that's relevant, but you need to be able to talk about, well, how is that variable related to uncertainty? Okay, and so as I walk through these, to be perfectly honest, I'm not great at animation, so I probably won't change the slide, but what I will do is kind of say positive or negative for each variable. And so what I'm trying to do there is to point out whether or not the variable is positively correlated with uncertainty or negatively correlated with uncertainty. So if you don't already understand that or have that in your notes, you'll make sure that that is something that hopefully you understand, after the next couple of minutes here. Okay. So verbal communication, right? Verbal communication is negatively correlated with uncertainty, right? If we are uncertain about a situation, odds are we are going to engage in a lot of verbal communication. Probably we're going to be asking questions, probably we're going to be talking a lot to share more about ourselves and to self-disclose, and so so you should put a little negative sign there between verbal communication and uncertainty in your notes. Okay, that's the first axiom. Moving on to the second axiom, we see the similar correlation. There's a negative correlation between uncertainty and nonverbal warmth. Right? Another way to say that might be the more nonverbal warmth behaviors we use, like smiling, making eye contact, head nodding, those kind of things, as those go up and the more we use them, uncertainty goes down. Right? Therefore, again, that makes that relationship negative. Information seeking. Information seeking, there is a positive correlation. And this one throws people a little bit here, so let me explain, right? Essentially what that's saying is the more uncertain we are, the more info seeking we need to engage in, right? So uncertainty is high, so is information seeking. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. It might also help to think of a situation where if uncertainty is low, then information seeking is probably also going to be low, right? Think about a situation where maybe you're hanging out with one of your really good friends, right? So someone where there's very little uncertainty. You've known this person for a while, you hang out a lot, right? You guys know each other really well, so there's low uncertainty. In that situation, probably you guys are really comfortable with silence. You're really comfortable maybe just, I don't know, telling inside jokes or whatever. You're not probably at that stage of your friendship spending a lot of time on a regular basis engaging in information seeking, right? It would, in fact, actually probably be kind of weird if you were continuing to ask questions, to gain information from this person all the time, right? So either way you think of it, you can see that there's a positive correlation according to this theory between info seeking and uncertainty. Either they're both high or they're both low. Hopefully that helps. But again, you want a positive there. Moving on to self-disclosure, right? Odds are, if you don't know someone very well, you are not going to feel that comfortable self-disclosing much to them, right? So in that particular case, if uncertainty is high, self-disclosure is low. There's a negative relationship. Let's try that again. Reciprocation, right? Reciprocity. There we go. Reciprocity and uncertainty are positively correlated. I would have put a positive sign there, right? And here's the explanation for that. When we are uncertain, we tend to engage in a behavior pattern where we mimic or reciprocate the behavior of another person, right? When we are uncertain, we tend to engage in social behaviors that follow the norm. Right? We're not going to deviate from those things yet because we haven't developed our own, relational customs yet, or norms, or inside jokes, right? So we stick with mimicking what the other person is doing and following social norms. So uncertainty high, reciprocity high, that means there's a little positive sign there. There is a negative correlation between similarity and uncertainty, right? Another way to say that would be the more similar you are to a person, the less uncertainty there is. When I think about things like that, you can think about similarity on a lot of different levels, but one place to start might be to think about just simply knowing that you and another person are both SVSU students. You have that in common. That in and of itself can maybe reduce some uncertainty about certain things. Certainly you can take that steps farther, right? Maybe you and another person are both on the intramural basketball team. So you have that in common. Having all that in common also can reduce uncertainty. Maybe you and this other person are the same gender or ethnicity or age or major, or fill in the blank there when we're talking about similarity. But again, there's a negative correlation between similarity and uncertainty, because the more similar you are, the more in common you have, the less uncertain you are. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, we're down to liking. Liking follows similar ideas, similarity, right? The more you like someone, the less uncertainty there should be, right? Okay, or you could say it another way, right? The less uncertainty there is, the more you like someone. Okay? And shared networks follows that very same pattern, right? The more people that you have in common, right? The more people that you interact with that are in this shared network of yours, the less uncertainty you're going to have. So again, we've got a negative correlation there. So at the end of this slide, hopefully now you have kind of an idea about how each one of these variables is either positively or negatively correlated with uncertainty, at least according to the theory. Again, that's an important piece that I felt was like missing in some of your CPAs. You can't just be able to recognize these variables. You need to be able to recognize them and their connection to uncertainty. If that continues to be unclear, I encourage you to go back, check out that textbook, or don't hesitate to send me an email. Okay, but if that's clear, right? If we could move on from there, then you'll notice the theory goes on to now make some theorems, right? And so all they're really doing here is taking two of the variables and putting them together, right? Rather than just having this simple correlation between something like liking and uncertainty. Now they're in the theorems, they're trying to say, okay, well, how do the two variables correlate and then relate to uncertainty? So you can see by doing that, by making all the possible combinations between the relevant variables, the theory comes up with 28 theorems. That's a little overwhelming, right? I'm not necessarily going to walk through all of those in this case, but let me highlight a couple of examples so hopefully you at least feel a little bit more comfortable reading the chart. Right? If we just start with the first one there, we can see that theorem 1 looks at nonverbal communication and verbal communication, and argues that there should be a positive correlation between those, right? So the more someone is talking, also probably the more nonverbal warmth behaviors they're using, right? I'm talking, I'm probably also making eye contact, head nodding, smiling, and some of those things, right? So the theorem says, okay, you're using both of those things, right? Verbal communication and nonverbal communication, ultimately those together should reduce uncertainty. Let me just do at least one more. I was going to point out, and I think theorem 17, I think sometimes this one's a little confusing because you see there's a negative sign there. So it's suggesting there's a negative correlation between information seeking and liking, right? And at first glance, that might seem kind of counterintuitive, but it goes back to the example that I used earlier. The argument is that if you really like someone, right, and you're good friends with them, then you probably aren't going to need to engage in a lot of information seeking at that point, right? Because you probably already know a lot about them, right? So you're not going to have to continually ask a bunch of questions and fill silence with inquiries, right? So the more liking, actually, the less information seeking that's going on. Okay, so there's a couple of examples. Hopefully that makes sense what these theorems are trying to do, and you can see what some of these kind of positive and negatives represent. Again, if you have some uncertainty about that, I encourage you to go back and check out that textbook, maybe practice using this chart a little bit more, or, again, of course, you can email me. Okay, so with all of that being said, right, the theory goes on to suggest that there's a variety of things that we can do to try to reduce our uncertainty. Right? And so one of the things we can do has to do with information seeking and getting more info. And the theory offers these 4 strategies for how we can get more info. Right? So for the exam, I want you to be able to identify and describe each strategy. I think overall people did a pretty good job with this in your CPAs. Right? You identified passive strategies as observation. So hopefully you can remember that. A passive strategy is simply observing, right? So maybe you are simply watching how another person or people interact from afar, right? And making observations that way, whether that's at a job interview situation, or maybe that's at a fraternity or sorority rush event, or honestly, maybe it's at like a restaurant or a bar on the weekend. Okay? A passive strategy involves simply observing from afar. The active strategies involve actually talking to a third party and asking them about the person or the situation where you're uncertain about, right? So maybe you are interested in someone and you go speak to their friend and ask information about that person from that friend. That would be called an active strategy according to the theory. Interactive strategies, you actually go interact with this person, right? You actually engage in a conversation with the person to learn more about them. And then finally, extraction strategies, right? This is relatively new development, but the extraction strategies are when you are using some kind of online or technique, right? And you're going on to a web page or the internet, right? So the example I tend to use on this one is, if you are getting ready to take a class, but you want to learn more about the professor, rather than maybe going and sitting down and talking with the professor, or maybe even instead of actually just going to ask another student who's had that professor, you hop on ratemyprofessor.com. Right? If you're doing that to try to learn more about the person, then you're using an extraction strategy. In order to make sure you really understand these strategies, as well as to kind of tie it back to the theorems and the axioms that we just discussed, I want you to watch a brief video clip here from Hitch. I don't know how many of you have seen this one or not, but it's starting to get a little bit dated here, but it's a real classic. And so I have the link to the video here. I don't think I'm going to play it right now because I've tried to do that when I've recorded lectures, and sometimes there's a little bit of a hiccup. So what I will do is just post the link to the video on Canvas. And so if you want, right now you could pause this and then actually go watch that video on the link and then come back. But either way, I encourage you to check out this video. As you're watching the video, first thing that you can really notice are the different info-seeking strategies that are being used, right? I mean, there's not really an example of extraction, but I think we see examples of the other 3, right? There's passive, active, and interactive strategies being used. So watch the video, make sure that you can identify those. Okay. I also think that we see some examples that support the theorems from the theory, right? I think that you will notice some of the correlations that the theory predicts regarding things like verbal and nonverbal communication, reciprocity for sure, coming out in this video as well. So you kind of test yourself, make sure that you're feeling comfortable with not only info strategies, but also some of the theorems by watching the video. Okay. If we were in class, we would come back together, we would discuss it. But I encourage you to take a few minutes to do that on your own right now. All right, we'll go ahead and move forward there. We have a couple more things to discuss regarding the theory. Here we go. All right, so the next thing to point out is that when we are anticipating engaging in a situation that has some uncertainty, not only do we engage in some information seeking strategies, we also engage in some things like trying to make a plan for how we're going to interact, right? And I've got a couple keywords here that were mentioned in your reading regarding our plan making, right? The first thing you see listed there refers to plan complexity. And that, of course, just has to do with how complicated our plan is, right? Are there a lot of different contingencies? Does our plan say, well, I'm going to try this, and if that doesn't work, then I'm going to do this, and if she says this, then I'm going to do that, and if he does this, then I'm going to do that, right? If there's all kinds of complexity to the plan, right? If we have this 21-point outline for how we are going to handle requesting a date, or how we're going to handle answering a question in an interview, then we have a highly complex plan, right? On the other hand, if your strategy is essentially to wing it, then you'd argue you don't have a very complex plan. Okay, let me actually skip down to the third one. The theory argues that probably a moderately complex plan is ideal, because the truth is, when we are actually in the middle of an interaction, we are not very good at modifying our plans, right? This is the hierarchy hypothesis. The truth is, even though a really complex plan might be able to get us to think about all kinds of different nuances of a situation and potential contingency behaviors, when we are in the middle of that interaction, we are terrible about actually making adjustments, right? So if our plan is really, really complex, odds are we're still not in the middle of an interaction, we're not going to use it. We're going to forget. We're not going to be able to kind of cognitively, handle that heavy load and actually use the plan. So that's the hierarchy hypothesis. We are able to adapt to the little things. We are able to change behaviors that don't require much thought, like maybe the volume that we use or the rate that we speak, but we are not good at changing high cognitive load type of behaviors, right? We're not really good at essentially thinking on the fly. Okay, so know the hierarchy hypothesis. With that being said, another thing that we tend to do with our plans is engage in this hedging behavior. Hedging behavior is anything that we do that really attempts to kind of mitigate face threat, right, or any kind of embarrassment. One example that I immediately think of would be if you were actually trying to ask your boss for a raise, right? Odds are most of us would not engage in a really direct request that had no hedging, right? That would sound something like, hey, I deserve a raise. When are you going to pay me more? Right? Most of us are not going to do that because we're concerned about a face threat, right? We're concerned about getting rejected. So instead, we might engage in some kind of hedging behavior, right? And there's a lot of different ways we might hedge. We might try to make it kind of a joke, right? Or use some kind of humor. Our boss walks into our office and we say, hey, I bet you're here to double my paycheck. Well, that's humorous. That's kind of a joke, but also we're putting it out there to see how the boss responds, right? So that would be an example of trying to use humor as hedging, right? We might also be kind of subtle or indirect, or we might use even some like retroactive statements to kind of dig ourselves out, right? Maybe we actually put it out there and say, hey, I was thinking about the budget and wondering if there was room, to increase my pay. And then based on how our boss responded, we might say, but we don't have to talk about that right now, right? Or some kind of retroactive statement like that might also kind of mitigate the initial statement that we made. Okay, so hedging is another way that we try to make these plans, but then also mitigate possible face threat. All right, so I think then in a nutshell, we've covered the overall idea of uncertainty reduction theory, and I didn't want this video to take too terribly long. It's been about 25 minutes. Hopefully it just helps solidify some of the things that you read about earlier. As far as critique of the theory, in general, the theory gets very high praise, right? It was one of the very first strictly interpersonal communication theories. A theory that wasn't borrowed from psychology or sociology or something like that, but a theory that was strictly developed to try to explain interpersonal interactions, and that can be applied to a whole host of different interpersonal reactions, whether it's romantic relationships or organizational communication or even intercultural communication. So the theory's been around a while. It's been tested quite a bit, right? Because it does have testable hypotheses. And so generally gets really high praise for that. You can see some kind of the ambivalence there has to do with the prediction of future events and the explanation of the data. Things get a little wonky when you have 28 different theorems, right? And trying to make sure that every one is tested and accurate and explains the situation every time, right? Things get a little fuzzy in that case. So that's why it gets kind of those yellow marks instead of the green ones, right? But overall, that is uncertainty reduction theory in a nutshell. Of course, email if you have any questions. Otherwise, good luck.